Okay, so to start off with, Tony Buckley is my name. You see Anthony Buckley up there. That's kind of the formal version. And this webinar is really a kind of a whistle-stop tour of major issues that are affecting customs at the moment. I try to cover as many of them as possible. Obviously, in an hour, I won't be able to go into them in huge detail, but then Chartered will be running a course later after the summer, and we can deal with those issues in more detail. I should say that this is my first experience of using a virtual background on Zoom, and I hope it's not disorienting for you to watch. So I'll just share my screen. And sorry, yeah, there we go. So we've entitled it Coping with Customs in 2024. There are a lot of major shifts in the administration of customs and indeed in customs law coming down the tracks. It's really a time of enormous change in international trade, and of course, customs as the underpinning, as it were, of international trade is changing as well. Increasingly, traders and clients of mine are reporting a more hostile customs environment, where for many years the attitude was to facilitate trade in every way possible. Now that attitude is shifting to one of questioning, checking, and insisting on security. And I just want to explain a little bit about that to start with. Today, we'll deal with an international overview, first of all, a brief look at what's happening around the world. Second, the EU customs reform, which is really going to change the lives of everybody involved with customs over the next few years. Great Britain and Northern Ireland, of course, always a major topic in Ireland, and I'll just speak briefly about where we are with that. Some new regulations that have been introduced or are being introduced, which again will point up the challenges into the future over the next couple of years. And finally, internal compliance program, something that I think every trading company should be considering as insurance against the oncoming challenges, to put it like that. So first of all, on the international scene, it seems certain at this stage globalization is effectively over. Some people will be happy about that. I think it's a pity. But globalization no longer drives policy. Instead, there's a focus on increasing regulation for all kinds of reasons, as we'll see when we come to talk about the actual regulations being introduced. Unilateral imposition of tariff and non-tariff measures. Tariff measures are extra duties, non-tariff measures, extra regulations that restrict the types of goods and impose new conditions on goods to be traded. And increasing the compliance burden on importers. The whole administration of customs enforcement is shifting. The World Trade Organization, which, I mean, marked the beginning of globalization when it was established in 1995, is increasingly sidelined and undermined, particularly by the USA, but also by other major players. It used to be that the WTO had great authority to control and direct tariff measures and international trade generally. That has decreased significantly in the last 7 or 8 years and seems unlikely to be restored in the near future. Just to look back, globalization was great. world trade increased by 287% between 2000 and 2022. It was, in historical terms, almost an unprecedented increase in world trade. And it led to great prosperity. You can see, if you look at developing countries, how their economies have blossomed over that period. And of course, for the developed countries in Europe, USA, and China, it was boom times, really. It was really a period of great growth, notwithstanding the financial crash in the middle of that period. Over that period also, major shifts in patterns of supply. Global supply chains became normal. Shifts in economic power, the rise of China and to an extent India, and in geopolitics, of course, as we know with the war in Ukraine and lots of tension in Southeast Asia and indeed wars in Africa. And these have led to the current revision of attitudes, because the changes that sprang from the increase in trade and the expansion of trade routes, those shifts led to political angst and hence a revision of attitudes. Some have called the new trend economic nationalism, but I would take economic nationalism to be a deeper and wider thing than just trade. A friend of mine, Professor Wolfgang from the University of Munster, coined the term glocalization, which, even though it's a little bit clumsy as a term, I prefer it because it reflects a global shift to a focus on local concerns, domestic concerns. The implications are profound for supply chains worldwide. Producers are now forced to revisit their supply chain. The idea of outsourcing, of sourcing your components from multiple countries, the idea of constantly looking at the cost of supplies and comparing with the cost of the same supplies from elsewhere and then shifting quickly. And indeed, the concept of just-in-time supply. All of those are now up for question. So we are in a period of profound change in international trade. Look at the USA. The Trump administration kind of broke the rules of the World Trade Organization when they invoked Section 301, as they call it, which is Section 301 of 1974 Act, to impose sanctions on Chinese goods. The Section 301 allows the USA to impose trade measures if they perceive unfair practices or unreasonable practices by the exporting country. Now, those words, unfair, unreasonable, are not in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which underpins the World Trade Organization. They're purely American concepts. And of course, it means that they can impose a duty for any reason they choose. The Biden administration has continued this. There was some hope internationally that a Democratic president would reverse this trend, but actually the Biden administration is continuing it, and they've announced further tariff increases, and I've included a table of the tariff increases they've announced. And as you can see, they are not small tariff increases. You're talking 25%, electric vehicles 100%, from the 1st of August next, and so on, all the way down the list. It's quite a serious imposition of duties. And if Trump is re-elected, he has promised, or some of his advisors have indicated, huge tariffs on all imports, including imports from Europe. If they impose duties of 60% on European imports, of course, Europe will respond. You'll have a trade war. So we wait and see, but it doesn't look promising. China, Chinese foreign trade grew by over 1,000% You remember I said that world trade increased by 287%. China increased by 4 to 5 times that. And it became the world powerhouse of manufacture. And that was largely kicked off by Europe and the USA transferring technology and production to China to avail of lower costs. Then the growth of distance selling was enhanced by COVID-19. During COVID-19, online sales just soared. It greatly benefited China because online sales, generally low value items, Chinese low cost of production enabled them to sell very cheaply, and they dominate online supply at this point. In 2023, 79% of imports to the EU were low value items. Now, they only accounted for 0.6% of the value of imports. So you would say, well, they're all low value. But then are we sure that the value that's being declared is a fair value or a true value? And plus the fact of sheer volume of clothes, of goods coming in, like clothing, textiles, technological products, the sheer volume severely undermines European business and European producers. It's very rare now, actually, to pick up a piece of clothing in a shop and see that it was not made in China. And it's even rarer to pick up a piece of clothing and see that it was made in the EU. So, yeah, the impact has been huge. In the process, China has become the second largest economy in the world and is now seen very clearly as a strategic threat by the West, as is described. And China has a declared antipathy to the hegemony of Western cultural norms. Xi Jinping has actually, in his speeches, said that it is important for China to counterbalance the culture and norms of the West. So that's a problem. In the EU, the invasion of Ukraine was seismic, particularly in terms of energy supply, but also in terms of the integrity and security of the EU. But there had already for several years been a growing concern about the impact of imports and our control of imports. How secure were our borders? How unified is the EU in terms of attitudes towards customs and imports and trade generally? So there has been a major refocus over the last 2 years, and a more general refocus on security of borders and security of supply. The whole cybersecurity debate is very important in the EU now. Add to that the sustainability agenda, where Europe prides itself on being ahead of most other areas in the world in seeking a sustainable means of production, sustainable practices, and so on. And the sustainability agenda has extended to include things like labor practices, social policies, and so on in the producing countries. So add that on to the concern about security, and you are suddenly looking at a generally protectionist EU. The strategic outlook is best set out. The document that I think you should look at if you want to understand the EU's attitude towards customs is the one cited there, putting more union in the European customs. It is referred to sometimes as the wise person's report. A panel of 10 representatives of countries and trade put together this report with the assistance of the Commission. Quite a remarkable document in that despite the fact that the EU has benefited from trade more than any other part of the world, and it is the world's largest trading bloc, the report doesn't once mention the desirability of encouraging trade or facilitating it. Instead, it focuses entirely on threats and on the need for the EU members to unite for what they call more secure borders. I might question some of their reasoning, but this is what the report says. And the EU customs reform proposals very much in keeping with this outlook. Specifically, new regulations and customs duties are proliferating. In terms of regulations, we now have some 380 regulations governing the importation and placing on the market of goods in the EU. 20 years ago, the number of such regulations was just 29. So it shows you this isn't a new trend, but it has accelerated. Moving on to EU customs reform. What is it? What's proposed? The Commission published proposals in May 23 for an ambitious package of measures. In keeping with several reports, the report I cited there is one of a series that highlighted specific deficiencies in the administration of customs. One of the big deficiencies identified is that different member states apply customs in different ways. And that led to a call for harmonization. So what they're proposing is new legislation, three main components there, a modernized Union Customs Code. So they're talking about replacing the Union Customs Code as it is, and they have published a draft of that, which you'll get on the EU Customs Reform webpage. Changes to the VAT directive to more specifically control e-commerce, as they call it, or distance sales. That is your online sales, online purchases. And then a specific new regulation for e-commerce. So it's largely, the reform is significantly focused at e-commerce or online sales. It does, however, have other very serious implications. Now, the stated objectives, what the EU says this reform is all about, are a new partnership with business. In other words, that importers, in particular, importers and exporters, would work hand in hand with customs in a partnership approach. A smarter approach to customs checks, that is, less checks at the border and more in-depth checks at company level, driven really by big data. So the idea is a big data store. You analyze that, identify risks, and then go and examine the companies, the businesses involved, rather than the individual transactions, moving away from the central importance of the customs declaration, which traditionally has been the key element of customs compliance. And then a more modern approach to e-commerce. More modern, yeah, okay, more controlling, I would say, but certainly, I suppose, it needed updating. Certainly the concept of an importer becomes quite vague when you talk about online shopping. So that concept did need modernization. So how are they going to do it? The key elements. First of all, the implementation will begin in 2025 and it will run to 2038. So this is a long program of restructuring, I suppose, the administration of the handling of imports and exports. They're establishing a single EU customs authority. So at the moment, the European Commission looks after customs and trade for the EU. However, the Commission doesn't have overriding authority over national administrations. This single EU customs authority will have overriding authority. They will be able to direct national authorities as to what risks should be checked, what procedures should be followed, and so on. So that's a very big move politically. A single EU customs data hub. Any declarations made any information filed by a trader will go into a central EU customs data hub, which will then be managed by the EU Customs Authority, which will carry out risk analysis, identify risks, and direct compliance programs on the basis of that information. They're talking about a single window for declarations, including tariff and non-tariff data. So the regulatory data, like certificates, proofs of safety, and so on, will all be filed in a single window. When that's in place, it'll be good. But when it will be in place is a question. A switch of emphasis from declarations to supply chain data. So when customs, the EU Customs Authority or the national authority comes to do a customs audit, they will be checking all the way back along the supply chain for compliance at all points. They're introducing a new trust and check trader status. This is like AEO, Authorized Economic Operator, which is in existence at the moment. But the added feature is that customs will have real-time access to traders' records and will be able to check that compliance procedures are in place. The benefit would be that for a trust and check trader, individual declarations may not be required at all. And there will be simplifications and easements that will be exclusive to TCT traders. It means that those who get the trust and check trader status will essentially be class 1 traders, as it were, and all the others who don't have this status will be class 2. And the implication is that for class 2, life is going to become more difficult, whereas for class 1, they will have a smooth and easy experience with customs. New definition of importer and exporter, I'll come back to that. New responsibilities for suppliers of goods through e-commerce. The e-commerce platforms will be deemed to be importers and will be required to comply as importers. They're also then, one of the proposals is to eliminate the €150 threshold for customs duties, which means that every item, regardless of value, would be subject to customs duties. And they are proposing a way of simplifying the declaration for low value goods so that you can lump them all together. You can lump a large group of goods together to make this declaration easier. But nevertheless, the fact that they're all liable to customs duties means that even the lowest value goods are subject to thorough checking and declaration. And for VAT, electronic platforms are deemed to be both the suppliers and receivers of the goods sent. In other words, the unregistered person who actually buys the item online will be out of the loop. All the responsibility will rest with the e-platform. So shifts in responsibility. A new role for indirect representatives. These are representatives who take responsibility for the import or export transaction at the moment. For non-resident e-commerce platforms, because they'll be deemed to be importers, they will need to have indirect representatives resident in the EU. Trust and check traders will have to take full responsibility for their entire supply chain, including the agent. So they will also need indirect representatives, and the indirect representatives will themselves need to be trust and check traders. So in other words, the entire supply chain would be visible to the customs authority, the EU customs authority, and hence to the national customs authorities. And the indirect representative is the deemed importer and liable for the full responsibilities of the importer, not just for filling out the declaration correctly, which is the present situation, but also for all of the other regulations that are now being applied by customs. The health, safety, and so on regulations are now being assigned to customs for customs to apply those regulations. And the importer is responsible not just for complying with customs law, but also with all the other regulations. So the responsibilities of an agent, particularly an indirect representative, are hugely expanded. The declarant, a phrase that we might all be familiar with, even though many of us struggle with understanding what exactly it means, the declarant is now being removed and being replaced by the importer and deemed importer. This being the person who causes the import or export to occur. And the importer's responsibility is extended to include those regulations applied by customs, as I described. The new TCT status, the benefits, if you can do it, are very large, but it also brings responsibility because the TCT trader must take responsibility for the compliance of the entire supply chain. So the TCT trader must certify that their suppliers are compliant. The central data hub will compile all the customs and non-customs data. And for people putting data in there, the challenge of ensuring that all the data from several sources is consistent, accurate, and up to date is a considerable challenge. And it will take some years for people to get their systems to match this concept that all the data must match and be consistent. The precautionary principle is a concept that underpins the thinking here. It's a concept that started off with sanctions, the sanctions against Russia and Belarus in particular, I suppose, in the last couple of years. There's a concept called the obligation of result. So that if, let's say, an item is found on a battlefield in the Ukraine, which originated in the EU and should not be in the part of the battlefield where it's found, then every operator in the supply chain is deemed to be liable for breaching the sanctions. And each operator must prove that they were not responsible and that they took all reasonable steps to avoid it. So that's a concept, if you like, that came from sanctions regulations. But then it's extended to the other regulations I'll be mentioning later, and it's expressed as the precautionary principle. And it's implicit in the new Union Customs Code, where the importer must take responsibility for any non-compliance detected, regardless of who was immediately responsible. And they must prove that they took steps to avoid that non-compliance, or else they must pay the penalty. So the implication is not enough to have specified documents or to fill certain boxes. They must have taken steps to validate the documents and thoroughly check the supply chain. So what's happening closer to home, Great Britain and Northern Ireland? This is the pattern of trade between 2018 and 2023. The red and purple lines on both charts are the gross imports and exports between Ireland and Great Britain. The more interesting ones perhaps are the blue and green lines, which are the imports and exports with chapters 30 and 50 excluded. Chapter 30 is energy, chapter 50 is pharmaceuticals and chemicals. You can see that the green line here, our imports from Great Britain have dropped quite significantly. They certainly dropped in 2021 due to COVID, but they've stayed low. And well down on 2020 and 2019. So Brexit has had a definite impact there. Our exports have not dropped, but they haven't risen greatly either. One would expect in 2024 to see exports affected as the UK border kicks in. But look at what happened with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland soared. It almost doubled. So while the if we take 2020, imports from Great Britain dropped by about 3 or 4 billion. But imports from Northern Ireland rose by 1.5 billion. So there is a clear diversion of trade through Northern Ireland. In layman's terms, I suppose you would say Northern Ireland is being used as a backdoor to circumvent the controls that apply to Great Britain. So where is that going? The reality of a customs border with Great Britain is now becoming clear. It's many people report that it's not terribly challenging. It's complex, and the regulations and the facilities are still being put in place. So there are some issues, but the attitude of HMRC appears to be quite positive and helpful, and most traders are finding it possible to cope with the border. Of course, it involves additional costs, additional administration, additional staff who need to be trained in how to cope with the new administrative requirements and so on. So it is to be expected that the volume of EU-UK trade will fall further. Even if the new UK government sits down with the EU and achieves something like a Norway or Switzerland deal, you're still going to see a drop in the volume of trade from its pre-Brexit levels, because the volume of trade with Norway or Switzerland is nowhere near what the volume of trade with the UK was pre-Brexit by any standard. As well as that, you will find that the pattern of trading will shift a bit, because as I mentioned there in the first paragraph, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has turned out to be much more challenging than anticipated, particularly in relation to proofs of origin. Proofs of origin of goods coming from the UK is a nightmare. It's really difficult. So there will be a change in the composition and the volume of trade, I think. There has been a diversion through Northern Ireland, but that back door, as it were, will not continue. In the next year, and it's beginning already, there will be checks, increasing checks in Northern Ireland on goods moving through Northern Ireland. So that back door, if you like, will largely close. However, it will continue to have major advantages as a distribution hub for the EU and UK, because third country goods cleared into Northern Ireland can then move on to the EU or the UK without any further customs. So that's a major advantage, major attraction. And it will also be a relatively low cost customs administration, because the Trader Support Service will remain in place as an assistance to traders. It's like having a free agent for each trader, paid for by the UK government. So that's a major advantage in Northern Ireland. Ireland, the Republic, will remain an attractive location in the EU for many GB businesses, and indeed for many American businesses that want to trade into Europe. So there are advantages and opportunities there. And for Irish exporters, establishment in Great Britain and cooperation agreements with British businesses provide considerable opportunities, and it's relatively easy for Irish businesses to set up this kind of duality where you have a location in the Republic and a location in Britain. So the trade will settle into a stable pattern and will continue. However, that stable pattern will be at a level which is not quite at pre-Brexit levels in terms of volume. The value is misleading because, as I showed in the graphs, energy and chemicals are such high value goods that they distort the picture. When you want to look at what's really happening with trade with Britain, you need to look down at things like clothing and footwear, for example, who where imports into Ireland from Britain are now running at 40% and 60% below pre-Brexit levels. And that has a big impact on Irish retail and distribution businesses. Moving on then, the regulations. Sanctions I have on the slide there. Actually, yeah, I've just realized I'm that previous slide was from an earlier version of the presentation. CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is in operation since the end of 2023. And it has required reports to be submitted since January 2024 on certain listed items, stating their carbon content. The carbon content to be calculated according to a calculator prepared by the European Commission. The information that I have is that, in fact, the level of reporting is very poor to date. Many businesses don't understand the reporting mechanism. There is a search, I've had some queries myself, a search by businesses for experts who can assist with setting up carbon reporting for companies. But from January 2026, which is not far away in terms of organizational planning, it will be necessary to actually pay for the carbon content. And the payment will be by way of companies purchasing carbon vouchers and then cashing in those vouchers as they import goods. So it's quite complex. As I say, the understanding of it in business is somewhat lagging behind what the Commission would have hoped for. But it is a major new initiative, a major new imposition on businesses. And it means that when you're importing goods with the carbon content, there will be effectively an additional duty in the form of a carbon tax that you have to pay on import. The GPSR, by the way, all of these are links on the left here, CBAM, GPSR, and ESPR, for those of you who are nerdy enough to want to go off and read them. And I would recommend, if you have any interest in customs, that you do go off and at least skim through these regulations to get the main points. The General Product Safety Regulation is challenging again. It is coming into effect on the 13th of December 2024. There are regulations governing the safety of goods. This General Product Safety Regulation, a bit like GDPR did for data, this extends the requirements for the safety of goods to all goods. Previously, certain categories of goods, like SPS goods, that is agri-food goods, and medicines, cosmetics, things like that, had specific regulations governing their content, their manufacturing, and their safety. Those regulations are left alone. But for all other goods, now, this general regulation applies. So it applies to things like toys, clothing, previously unregulated goods, industrial goods, and so on. And the importer or distributor of the goods must ensure the products are manufactured according to the safety regulation. In this case, the importer or the distributor of goods would be deemed to be the manufacturer in a situation where the goods are found to be unsafe in some way. For example, if they contain toxic chemicals. One of the big examples used in promoting this regulation was a certain compound which adds an aroma to makeup and cosmetic products. And this particular compound is deemed to be carcinogenic. But it's in very many products imported from third countries. If such a compound was found in a product, then the person who placed it on the market, which is either the importer or the distributor of the goods, would have to take on the responsibility of the manufacturer and would be liable for any penalties and damages that might apply from the sale of that product. Of course, the immediate sanction against unsafe products on the market is that they can be removed from the market, simply taken off the shelves. So this is a very wide implication. It applies, it's effective from the 13th of December. There's been very little really publicity around it. And I guess the implementation of it will perhaps vary a bit from country to country. It will begin to bite, and certainly because the regulation becomes effective on the 13th of December, even if enforcement of the regulation takes a year or more to become real, the authorities can look back to the 13th of December, which is the effective date. So it's something we really need to be aware of. And then potentially even bigger is the Eco-Design for Product Sustainability Regulation, which is known as ESPR. Excuse me just a moment. Sorry, I picked up a slight cold over the past week. But the ESPR, Eco-Design for Product Sustainability Regulation, again, it's an example of where sustainability is a very flexible word in Europe. Again, it applies to all goods not currently specifically regulated or products whose regulation doesn't extend as far as this regulation goes. What it envisages is that each product will have a digital product passport, proving its compliance with requirements. Now, the requirements are not yet fully set out, but they are very extensive. They cover the manufacturing, the components, the quality of components, the safety to some degree, the recyclability of the components, whether the components are such that there is planned obsolescence in the product. That would be prohibited. So the idea, as we all know, if you buy a washing machine, you get 5 years out of it, and then when its 5-year warranty is up, it'll shut down. We all know that. That is to be prohibited or at least discouraged strongly. As well as that, they're talking about managing the performance of goods. So is it repairable? Can it be recycled? As I mentioned, can it go on indefinitely in life by repairing it frequently? These kind of concerns. We haven't seen the detail yet. An implementing act and a delegated act are to be published, as already has been done with the Union Customs Code, and they will contain the detail. But the first implementation deadline is April 2025. That's when the Commission will come out with their list of items and the conditions that are applied to them. It's very, very wide-ranging. One of the interesting things about it is that each new product, as it were, a newly manufactured product, will have a digital product passport. And that will prove its compliance with requirements. This is an application perhaps of the concept of blockchain, where all of the certificates, the proofs and so on of compliance will be lumped together into a digital product passport, which will be stored in a central registry. And then each item, so if you're talking about, what would be an appropriate case here? Well, what is high on the list of products to be dealt with first, for example, are textiles. So you have a particular textile that is designed. It has a digital product passport, but then each shipment of that and each item, each roll of cloth, each carpet, whatever, must have a barcode or other data carrier. So in some cases, it might even be a microchip embedded in the item. More commonly, I imagine it would be a barcode, a scannable barcode on the product, so that when it is on a shelf in a shop or a warehouse, a consumer can come along, can scan the barcode, and can then check that this product has an up-to-date digital product passport filed in the central registry. As far as customs are concerned, they can scan the barcode and they can get into the central registry and look at the details of the digital product passport. So this is a really clear example of how customs checking is becoming much more intrusive, much more detailed, and indeed expanded across the entire supply chain, not just focusing on the declarant as it has up to now. So it's a very important one. It won't be fully implemented for several years, but as I say, the Commission is to publish its first what they call work program, which is the requirements for certain goods in April 2025. So this is coming and needs to be watched. One of the clear provisions of the regulation is that for large companies, destruction of unsold goods will be prohibited. So if goods are unsold, they must be recycled, remanufactured, or otherwise dealt with. They cannot be destroyed. Now, that particular provision will not apply to SMEs until 2030, and for micro companies, it won't be a requirement. But for major retailers and major importers, it will be a requirement from 2025, and that's going to really change the economics of certain types of products. So how do you deal with all this then? The internal compliance program. Now, the internal compliance program is something that I'm promoting myself. It arose in the context of sanctions. And the idea was to give companies insurance against the risk that I mentioned earlier, that if there was a sanctions breach, the importer, the guy at the end of the chain, was deemed responsible and had to prove innocence. And this Commission recommendation is very short. It's only a couple of pages. But its purpose was to advise companies on the steps they should take to avoid goods being diverted. And I'm now advising all my clients to read this, think about it, and if you like, it formalizes what we've been saying for years about compliance with customs is about anticipating, that you must look forward and have the structures in place so that when customs comes asking awkward questions, you have the answers readily to hand. The key elements that they've mentioned here are top-level management commitment. Yes, senior management has to buy in. Your structure, your assignment of responsibilities, for example, using risk registers and things like that, that all has to be carefully put in place. Training and awareness raising so that everybody in the company knows exactly what they're supposed to do and why. Transaction screening, going back over transactions and looking at them and saying, well, yeah, that was okay, or we made an error there, let's correct it, that kind of thing. So internal audit, really. Performance review, audits, in this case would be internal audits, reporting and corrective action, record keeping, vital, and physical and information security, just keeping goods and your IT systems secure. I've been teaching these concepts for some years, but this recommendation, as I say, draws it together very neatly. And even though it is directed in the context of sanctions, it applies equally to the new regulations that are either already in place or coming into place. There's another thing here, which is there is under the EU Customs Code, the new proposed EU Customs Code, a new responsibility for agents. It's very important for agents to have an internal compliance program. At the moment, I'm dealing with a couple of cases where customs is actually seeking to collect additional duty, not from the importer, but from the agent, and is alleging that the agent was deficient in some way in their handling of the cases. And this is going to be, I think, an increasing trend, that rather than chasing multiple small businesses, it's easier, simpler, and very tempting for customs to pursue the agent who processed the declarations. And agents have a special responsibility, as I say, under the proposed EU customs reform. So agents need to take this whole compliance concept very seriously indeed. Because, of course, from an agent's point of view, if a client comes in and wants to import goods, you'll charge them a fee, which is a small fee. But then you do that hundreds of times. And then when customs comes and rolls up all these hundreds of transactions together and finds that additional duty is due, the sum can be something that an agent simply can't afford to pay. So it's quite serious. Finally, I'm going to look at, I see I have something in the chat and a Q&A. I'll come to those in a moment. But just to mention, Chartered are running a new iteration of the Certificate in Customs and Trade this autumn. It will be, for me, the 11th running of the program. We have graduated about 200 students since 2020, which is quite a good number. And each of those has a formal and recognized qualification as a customs advisor. We have evolved the content very significantly, and we've also expanded the course in this next iteration. We're very happy that BDO has offered to do an extra half day on top of the normal 4 days of the course. There will be an extra half day of insights from BDO experts on the operation of customs controls, and we look forward to that. Our team of teachers has also expanded and changed somewhat, and the topics will cover all of the major issues, including those we've talked about today. Now, let's see, we have questions. Right, okay, that's okay. And right, yeah. We have a question. UK company that had hoped to use the VAT IOSS, the import one-stop shop, to export to the EU, but they can't find anyone to act as their intermediary. How would it work for them to use Northern Ireland? Presumably the goods need to physically move through the north, and they're destined for third countries, so they need to clear customs. Where would that happen and how would it work? Well, the answer, Laura, is fairly simple. Northern Ireland is a good route to follow to come into the EU. It won't eliminate the VAT IOSS issue. Really, they don't necessarily, for the IOSS, they don't need an intermediary resident in the EU. The IOSS registration, for example, the UK company could register for VAT IOSS under a non-resident VAT number in Ireland. So they would continue to be a resident in the UK, but they would account for their EU VAT in Ireland. Now, I know that in some EU countries, notably France, there is pressure and perhaps even an insistence that you have a fiscal representative. And that can be difficult to find. But I would explore the possibility of registering in Ireland as using a non-resident VAT registration. The attraction of Northern Ireland is the goods could be exported from Great Britain to Northern Ireland very simply. They would be imported into Northern Ireland using the trader support system of declaration. And they might have to pay duties depending on what they are, what the goods are. But then once cleared into Northern Ireland, they can move anywhere in the EU without further customs. However, if they're sold to people in various EU countries, the VAT for each country has to be accounted for. And that's where the IOSS crops up. Thank you very much and have a lovely day.